This is the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview. Today with us we have Joe Atwill, author of Caesar's Messiah. Thank you very much for appearing on. How are you doing today, Joe?
I'm fine, and thank you for having me, Miguel.
It's my pleasure. So, as the introduction said, we know about your book and your thesis. And what I'd like to know is, at what point did you begin to suspect that Jesus wasn't a historical personage, but an invention of those in power in Roman times? When was that aha moment?
It was a gradual process that led to an aha moment. I began studying the Dead Sea Scrolls 15 years ago. I had been raised a Christian. In fact, I grew up in Japan and had a very strict Christian pedagogy with Jesuits who were constantly training us in the Gospels and the New Testament. And so I had fallen away from the faith, but I was still quite interested in the history of Christianity. And when the scrolls became sort of the well-known and the issues in terms of what were the scrolls that weren't being released consisted of, what were the information inside of them, I was interested in that and started studying them. And the more I studied the scrolls and the more I studied the history of the era, it seemed more and more suspicious that Christianity could have come organically from Judea, because that region, for the 100 years that Christianity was supposedly emerging, in fact had a messianic movement that was militaristic and fought against Rome. And so it just seemed incongruous to me that a pacifistic messianic movement would have emerged at the same time. And so then I began to study the Gospels themselves, trying to determine who had produced the literature. And it was because I had spent so much time studying the history of the era, particularly Josephus, Flavius Josephus's accounts, that when I read the Gospels, I started noticing that in fact, there seemed to be a kind of interrelationship between them. And I noticed, for example, that Titus Flavius, fished for men at the Sea of Galilee. I didn't associate any particular meaning to it, but it did seem unusual. But then as I went through Titus's campaign, trying to determine if there were more links to the Gospels, even though at this point I didn't really know what they might mean, it became clear to me that the Gospels, in fact, were simply a kind of comic mockery of Titus's campaign, and that the Jews were actually being held up to ridicule. So that's the entire process, how I went through it.
But the Vespasians, or specifically Titus, it wasn't just ridicule; it was also propaganda, right?
Of course. The purpose of the Gospels and Christianity is manifold. They wanted, as best that can be determined, they wanted to replace the militaristic messianic movement with one that was pacifistic and would pay taxes. So this was the overt and obvious historical reason that Christianity came into existence at this time. This is why it was always headquartered in Rome, and this is why the Messiah is a pacifist as opposed to the normal son of David that one would expect, which would be a nationalistic warrior. So this was the overt purpose of Christianity. But the Gospels are a kind of literary miracle in a sense, in that they also contain a very clear message as to who wrote them and why they wrote them. In other words, the Gospels are actually a way of envisioning Caesar as God, and this is a hard to get one's mind around concept, because the Gospels are so totally associated with the character of Jesus. But when you understand the typologic literature of the era, and specifically when you understand the typology of the birth narrative in Matthew, you can see a kind of literary genre that enables someone to leave a message that is not overt, not in the text itself, but is quite clear. In the birth narrative in Matthew, the message is that the life of Moses, who was the first savior of Israel, foresaw Jesus' life. So he was Israel's second savior. And if it's all right, I'd just like to go through the process of, that typology actually works, so that people can understand it.
No problem.
The fishing, the narrative is based on the story of Moses, and you start out in the birth narrative in Matthew. You have at Matthew 2:13, Joseph goes down to Israel. Very simple concept, and this is mirrored in the Old Testament in Genesis 45:50. Jesus goes down to Israel. Matthew 2:16, Herod massacres the boys, and this is mirrored in the Old Testament Exodus 1. Pharaoh massacres the boys. Matthew 2:20, there is a statement, "They are dead who sought your life." This is verbatim repeated in Exodus 4. All the men are dead who sought your life, and so on. You go Matthew 2:21, you return from Egypt to Israel. In Matthew 3:13, you pass through water. As Exodus 14, you pass through the water, and these are both baptisms. And then you go into the wilderness, 40 years in the Old Testament, 40 days in Matthew. Matthew 4:4, you're tempted by bread. Exodus 16, God is tempted by bread. And Matthew 4:7, you have a little story about do not tempt God. And then finally, you conclude with Matthew 4:10, worship only God, which is mirrored in Exodus 32, worship only God, have no other gods in front of you. So what the author of Matthew has done is he picked concepts from the Old Testament and put them in Matthew in the same sequence. And this is the only example of this particular typologic genre that anyone knows about. Very specific genre. You have concepts and names, locations, Joseph going down to Egypt, and you have a sequence. This is the beginning of the typologic linkage in Matthew, and it links to the beginning of the story in the Old Testament. So this is a very, it takes a little time sort of to work with it and get how it actually operates, but this is not something that's controverted by scholars. Everyone accepts it, that there is what's called typologic mapping,
right.
That Matthew is dependent upon the Old Testament, that the author of Matthew has created fiction. And this has enormous implications, even though it's not well known by the public. But, I mean, first of all, that the name of Jesus' father as Joseph is clearly fictional. In other words, it's simply been selected because that was the name of where the author decided to begin the typology, and he needed to start linking to names and concepts, and so he chose Joseph, who went from Israel to Egypt. There's no other purpose for the name. It's one can argue against it, but I think any reasonable person will accept the fact that this is just fiction. It's just the author is taking the name and putting it into Jesus' story because he wants to make this point that the life of Moses, who had that divine connection to God, was foreseeing the life of Jesus. And if you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know that this concept of typology, of looking in the Scriptures for information about the righteous teacher or the Messiah, is in many of what's referred to as peshers in the Old Testament. Probably the best known as the Habakkuk pesher. And in that, the Jewish author is looking in the Old Testament for patterns, for things that he can see that will link to the life of the righteous teacher, which will give him some information that he can pass on about the Messianic era that is about to occur. And This is the framework that the author of Matthew is operating in. He's created a more sophisticated version. The versions of the typology in the Dead Sea Scrolls does not use this very precise format of sequence, and it's not quite as clean as the stuff Matthew did, but you can see what the author is referring to. So if someone is familiar with this genre, then you can simply go forward to the next phase of Jesus' life, of the story of Jesus, and you can see that the exact same system has been used to construct the adult ministry of Jesus. So Jesus, the Gospels have essentially two halves to them. The first half looks backwards to Moses, and the second half looks forward to another individual, Titus Flavius. And the first thing that one has to understand about Titus Flavius to really get the truth of the Gospels is simply that Jesus looks forward to the coming of the Son of Man. Throughout the Gospels, there are statements about the Son of Man who's going to come, and he refers to this individual usually in the third person. People assume he's talking about himself, but the fact is he is simply talking about an individual who he gives the title the Son of Man to, and he says when this individual comes, you're going to have all these terrible things happen. You're going to have Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall, the temple will be razed, and the Galilean towns will be laid low. So it gives you very clear information about the Son of Man, what's going to happen when this guy comes. Well, there's only one individual in history who, in fact, can be has the claim of being the Son of Man that Jesus envisioned, and that's Titus Flavius. He is the individual who did lay low the Galilean towns. He did encircle Jerusalem with a wall, and he did raise the temple. So this individual is a unique historical character. Furthermore, he is also an individual linked to the origins of Christianity. His sister is Flavia Domitilla, one of the very first saints, and his family produced the very first catacombs. The oldest archaeologic evidence of Christianity, of course, is the catacombs, and there are still inscriptions in existence which honor the fact that the Flavian family had donated to them. So this individual is very much associated in this odd way with Christianity. He fulfilled all of Jesus' prophecy, and his family, they have been promoting the religion, providing it with its original catacombs, and all of its first saints. In other words, Neros and Achilles, the oldest saints in the Roman Catholic faith, are flatly identified as what's called the Christian Flavians. If you go on the Christian Encyclopedia and just key in Flavia Domitilla or any of the Christian Flavians, all these names will pop up. There's all these Flavians who are associated. So anyway, this guy is quite unusual historically. And then when you are familiar with the typology that Jesus is the ministry this pre-ministry. When you're familiar with the system of typology of sequence, names, locations, concepts that are all occurring one after another, same sequence. When you're familiar with that, now you can understand the Gospels. All of those things are needed so you can actually move forward. And then when you look at the fishing for men episode in where Jesus predicts that his followers will fish for men, suddenly now you can link to Titus, and you can see that all of these events are conceptually related, and they occur in the same sequence. In other words, you have the fishing for men, you have the demon of Gadara, you have a naked individual who escapes at Gethsemane, and bizarre concepts such as a son of Mary who is a human Passover lamb. 3 crucified, 1 survives, taken down by Joseph of Arimathea. And then both ministries, Jesus and Titus campaign, end with Simon being condemned and John spared. And what's fascinating is all of the, not all, but virtually all of these relationships have been noted by other scholars. There's just a ton of research on, for example, the human Passover lamb in the Gospels. You can go online and honor Chapman. Professor Chapman has just produced a paper on it showing the linkage to the Gospels. The ludicrous parallel between the three crucified, one survived stories is well known to scholars. A number of scholars have commented on it.
Yeah, hold on, Joe.
I'm sorry.
That's what happens when Josephus asks Titus to. There's three, and he asks to save one, or one survives, right?
That's right. In other words, you have if you're trying to map Jesus onto Titus after the human Passover lamb, who's the son of Mary, in the ministry of Titus, you have an episode where Joseph Bar Matthias comes to Titus just like Joseph Arimathea comes to Pontius Pilate, and there's a group of three being crucified, and Josephus asks permission from the Roman commander to take them down from the cross. This occurs, and one magically survives. So the concepts are not verbatim parallels. In other words, they are conceptually very close, but in the same method as is used in the Jesus-Moses typology. There is, they're not absolutely verbatim, and this enables the construction of this secret about Titus. It's somewhat ludicrous, actually, that we've been having this conversation, because it's just not that hard to see. The connections, for example, the passage that I'm referring to about Titus having the same conceptual episode that Joseph Arimathea did. I'll just read it to you. Readers,
Sure.
Viewers can listen. It says, this is Josephus writing, and he says, "Moreover, when the city Jerusalem was taken by force, I was sent by Titus Caesar to a certain village called Thekoa in order to know whether it was a place fit for a camp. As I came back, I saw many captives crucified and remembered three of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind and went with tears in my eyes to Titus and told him of them, so I immediately commanded them to be taken down and to have the greatest care taken of them in order to their recovery. Yet two of them died under the physician's hand while the third recovered." Now, if you took that passage and gave it, to a group of people with a whole bunch of other passages from Josephus and said which one of these passages could possibly be linked to the crucifixion story in the gospel, rest assured, everyone would pick that one.
Right.
It's very, now, they might not even notice that the last names are very surprisingly similar. And I just digress for a second. In the Gospels, you have all of these names that are close to being the same. For example, Judas Iscariot and the movement that was fighting against the Romans are the Sicarii. It's essentially the same word. It's just one letter has been taken and moved from one place to another. Well, here you have the same thing. You have Joseph Arimathea and Joseph Bar Matthias. What's fascinating is that in the old Gospels like the Gospel of Barnabas, he isn't called Joseph of Arimathea. They refer to him as Joseph Bar Matthias.
Wow.
They actually, for somehow there was some editing that went on to the Gospels, and to make it more difficult to see, I suspect, and they deleted the first name. It's again when you have a word like that that's so similar, and it fits into a passage that's so similar. Certainly one natural, commonsensical, curiosity that would come to anyone reading is are these things all building up to a pattern? But in the Josephus, that particular story, the three crucified, one survives just pops out so obviously that you don't even need to go to this other stuff where it's Joseph of Arimathea and it's the Roman commander being begged. It just would hold up on its own by any, I think, reasonable criteria as being possibly linked. In other words, it begs the question. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you determine if in fact it's dependent? I mean, it's certainly, it's just self-evident to me that it rises to the level of curiosity and suspicion. We should be trying to make some determination of whether or not it's real. Well, once you know the typological genre that's been established in Matthew, you can easily verify that it's dependent simply by determining where it is in the overall scheme of the mapping. And so you just go backwards, just like you would in the Gospels, and you come up with the next big concept, which is the human Passover lamb. Well, I mean, a human Passover lamb is a completely bizarre concept. It's an absolute violation of Judaic dietary laws, which incidentally come directly from God. So these are not, it's not Weight Watchers we're talking about. I mean, these are the dictums that are expressed in terms of blood and human and flesh eating. In fact, human flesh eating is always characterized in the Old Testament as what happens when the Jews are wicked. So, you don't have human Passover lambs as concepts that are just, frequent in Judaic literature. There's only two of them. There's only two, and they're the one in Josephus and the one in the Gospels. And so again, if you work backwards, you'll see that 3 crucified, 1 survived, and then you go backward, well, there's the human Passover lamb. And then
Joe, could you tell us a bit about the Passover lamb in Josephus that gives them Cannibal Mary?
Cannibal Mary, probably the most famous non-gospel character, and it occurs in Josephus, Book 6, lines 201, 219, if anyone is listening who has Josephus. You can, the passage is about a page and a half, so it's a little bit too long to read, though I'd be happy to if you want, but I can paraphrase. It certainly is that it's a woman whose name is Mary. She is from the house of Hyssop. She is starving. She's there for the Passover, but there's no food. So she takes her son and she eats half of him after she roasts him.
Yeah.
And then people come in and they say, where's your food? These are zealots who are looking for food. And she hands them over her son, saying, well, here he is. Eat your fill. And they're so disgusted that they leave and they run out. Well, what should be recognized, first of all, and I just have no idea where scholarship is, why they're not seeing these connections, but hopefully your readers will have more open minds and they can simply follow through with it, because everything I'm showing you is so straightforward and so simply right there in the text. This is not some mystery stuff. It's right there. The child is referred to as being of the house of Hyssop. Okay, well, this clearly helps complete the pattern of a Passover lamb. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is established as a Passover lamb by 2 devices. One is his limbs are not broken, and that's one of God's instructions on how to prepare the Passover lamb. And the other is that the Roman soldiers touches him with hyssop, right?
Right.
Like they touch the houses, right? Okay. Well, here you have the child is referred to as the house of hyssop, and they don't, they're not refuse to break his legs, but they roast him, which is the other of the 3 instructions from God. So you have the roasted, and then the mother goes on and describes the child as my sacrifice. So in the passage, you have the child is established as being of the house of hyssop. He is the roasted sacrifice of the house of hyssop. These are not, you can't really go very far away from this concept because it's simply right there in front of you. The child is the roasted sacrifice of the house of hyssop. If anyone who is Jewish, you would know immediately what that is. It is simply the Passover lamb. To complete the pattern, the child's mother is named Mary. The location is Jerusalem. Mary is a common name, but it's not 100%. So it just adds to the unusual pattern. One thing I did not put in Caesar's Messiah, because the editors in their wisdom took it out, was that there is the absolute straightforward confession by the Romans that they invented Christianity. It is embedded inside this passage.
Really?
You need to read Greek, unfortunately, to be able to see it. But there is a word play which they use 3 words. Recall we talked about Arimathea and Bar Matthias, how they subtly change the meaning or camouflage things by changing one letter. So in the passage, the child is referred to as a myth for the world.
Really?
Okay? Yeah, human
Wow.
Passover lamb, and then they say he is a myth for the world, but it gets much better. That myth is would be spelled in English Mythos. Okay? Josephus then goes on and creates some very amazing puns. He says that this mythos will be seen by the Gentiles as a mythos. In other words, from Mythos, you go to Mysos. Mythos, mesos. The myth for the world that the child is will be seen as an atrocity by the Jews, and then this will cause bitter hatred of the Jews, and that word is mythos, Misos. So you have the child is flatly declared to be a myth for the world, whose killing will be seen by the Gentiles as an atrocity, and that this will cause bitter hatred of the Jews. If this is not, bear in mind, this is buried inside a description of a human Passover lamb who is the son of Mary. If this is not a straightforward declaration of both the creation and the purpose of the religion, I just don't know what could be clearer.
And you also mentioned that both Marys, the canonical Mary and the
Yeah.
Josephus Marys, are pierced in the heart.
Yeah, there's other little clues inside the thing. There's two clues. One is that both the cannibal Mary and the mother of Jesus are being it's actually this perfect logical continuation. Mary is predicted in the Gospels that her heart will be pierced. This Mary is said to have her heart having been pierced. Also in the Gospels, you have a Mary who is, the sister of Lazarus, who says that Jesus has said that she has chosen the fine portion which will not be taken away from her. Actually, this is one of my favorite. You can see how vicious the Gospels really are when you kind of catch this particular joke. Jesus, is asked by Martha, how come I have to do all the serving and my sister Mary is not doing anything? And Jesus says, Mary has chosen the fine portion and it shall not be taken away from her. Notice it is a prophecy.
Right.
They're very innocuous, but there it is. Well, in the Josephus passage, the men come and ask for the food, and she says, I've saved a very fine portion for you.
Oh,
But
dear.
the fact is, they say, well, we don't want to take it away from you. So you can see both the brilliance of the authors of the gospel. I mean, these guys were the absolute best literary craftsmen that have ever existed. And you can also see the hatred and the vicious nature of the humor. And one of the hard things that scholars, and of course Christians, it's almost impossible, that scholars have with my work is that it leaves such a bitter and black impression of the Gospels. Many scholars have, even those who are mythicists who think that it was created by benign creation of people who had some kind of merging from some mystery cult or whatever. They have this funny idea about the nature of Jesus. When you really see the actual nature of the Gospels, it is a devastating vision, and so it's hard for people. They want to resist it, but I think if you just start with this passage, it won't take any ordinary person too much time to come to the conclusion that it is somehow linked to the gospel. You don't have to get into interpretation. Just try to see if all of these linkages could occur in such a short passage. You have the same system of creating a human Passover lamb, Mary. You have a human Passover lamb, which is of course just a concept that's singular, because it's a violation of the Judaic dietary law. And then all of these little comic linkages between the passages. It strongly suggests dependency. Now, when you then return to the question of is there typologic mapping, you also have sequence. The same thing. And incidentally, the scholars, of course, are there are many people who have gotten into the Candle of Mary passage, and quite a few of them have even linked it to the Gospels. But just an example of where the myopia of scholarship is the fishing for men episode. I mean, to me, this is just cries out for some explanation. I mean, Jesus starts out the Sea of Galilee, and he says, you're going to be fishing for men. Well, Titus Flavius comes to the Sea of Galilee. They sink the Jewish rebels' fishing boat, and they catch them like fish. Even if you don't want to have a position in terms of interpretation, the idea that it is linked should at least be explored. But you can go through every single piece of scholarship on the Gospels in literature, and no one has ever even bothered to take one step toward this, even though any one of your listeners can just pick up Josephus, go to Book 3, follow Titus right to the Sea of Galilee, watch him sink the fishing boats, and then watch as the Jews are caught like fish.
Yeah, and it's, he says it's legion, which is what, 2,000? Which is the same as what Jesus says.
A legion is actually 6,000.
Oh,
but it
okay.
Typically has, there'll be 6,000 troops, and then, you have a group of people that support it, and so it's a bit of number. But the that would be the next, and the next, if you start and incidentally, if you just compare Titus's activity before the battle, where he talks about essentially, the divine nature of the Roman Caesar and how we are about to enter into, my first big battle, and now we're going to show that I'm worthy of my Father. Well, you have to remember, Jesus talks about his Father as a divine person, as God. Right? Titus's father was God. He was actually deified by the Roman Senate. So when Titus is there describing, my Father, we have to show that this is all going to be, worthy of my Father. It's a very close conceptual parallel to Jesus right on the onset, because they're not singular, but it's not like there's hundreds of people who have fathers who are God, and this is somewhat unusual. And then you have the fishing for men. I had a debate with Robert Price.
Right. Yeah,
and there was an absolutely amazing moment in this, because Price takes the position, since all of these parallels are in sequence, and they are, and they if one sees them as being linked, it's hard not to accept the fact that it is the same genre that occurs between Jesus and Moses. It's just going on in the adult ministry. So Bob took the position that, the parallels are it's parallel mania. He says you're just seeing things, that the concept is not really correct. And then he went on to explain, he tried to, but in the middle of his explanation, he just stopped, because what occurred was he realized that he was the one, when he was trying to claim that Jesus' words are, representing the evangelical future of his disciples, he is the one who is making the metaphorical leap. See, one of the absolute incredible aspects of the Jesus-Titus typology is that it's hidden in plain sight. In other words, when I say there is linkage between Jesus' words and the activity of Titus at the Sea of Galilee, I'm just using the literal interpretation of Jesus' words. And the same thing in Cannibal Mary. When I say that these are linked, Jesus flatly states that you must eat the flesh of the Son of Man or you will have no life in you. So to the idea that these are parallel mania linkages is, not a coherent criticism, because the fact is the way the structure is built, it is the literal definitions of the word. In other words, parallels can be weak because, there's no context. It's like, I see a parallel between Little Red Riding Hood and Hitler or something. There's no context. Or they can just be conceptually very weak, where only one person in a million would see this linkage. Well, here, when Jesus says fishing for men, and I say, it's linked over here, I am not the one, that is parallel mania. I'm just saying, hey, this looks linked because the words flatly mean fishing for men. So anyway, that's the difficulty scholars have is simply, and this, a number of them are supporting now, but the problem that people do have is just I don't think they're familiar with the criteria of the Jesus-Moses typology. Once you're familiar with it, once you know how it works and how the concepts work, believe me, it's not difficult to do the linkage between Jesus and Titus.
Right, definitely. And for the listeners, this is just scratching the surface. Joe gives us dozens of more examples, and you can definitely check out your book. But the question I have dealing with the whole canon is the inner circle of Titus, including Josephus, created this
Right.
propaganda machine, which
Right.
was also the other reason was to make sure that when they worshiped Jesus, they were worshiping Titus, because
Right.
that's what he wanted. He wanted the Jews to call him Lord, but he couldn't get them to do that.
Right.
But where does the Pauline corpus fit in all of this? Was that part of the inner circle, or was that something separate?
My interpretation of the Pauline corpus is that it was written after the Gospels, and they wanted to fill in the time frame between the life of Jesus and the war. There was a 40-year span, and again, this is another very clear indication of the linkage between Titus and Jesus, is that Jesus says that this will occur before a generation passes away. And a generation was 40 years. It comes from Exodus, where it's written that the 40 years of the wandering is necessary for all of the men of war to die out, so Jews can go into the promised land. So the linkage between Jesus and Titus is exactly 40 years. And incidentally, to the day, his 40 years began Jesus' ministry, and that began Titus's encircling Jerusalem, and then Masada is 73, and that's exactly 40 years to the day from supposedly Jesus' resurrection. So you have this very obvious linkage of time between the two events. But to fill in this period, and in my opinion, to camouflage the fact that historically the Messianic movement was in opposition to Rome during this period, and just to make the community of Jesus that is established in terms of historical time at 33 AD, they then added Paul to the mix for a number of reasons. Now, to really understand Paul, you just have to look at his conversion, where he claims to be killing members of the Way, which is obviously the Messianic movement. He's killing them. And then he has an epiphany, falls off a horse, comes to a couple days later,
Right.
And good heavens, he says, that's not the right thing to do. I should be converting these people to Jesus.
Oh.
Well, this is exactly what happened to the Flavians. In other words, they were the ones who were fighting members of the Way. They had the epiphany, this is a complete waste of time and money. And then they started to convert people to the Messianic version. So it's just a little comic vignette, and to imagine like the first authors of Batman, the comic book, but once the genre has been established, then 70 years later you can have other writers picking it up and adding to it and creating vignettes, and so that's all you have with Paul is just a completely ludicrous exposition based on, and if you go through Paul's statements, he is so anti-Jewish and so pro-Roman that he just makes no sense historically. The Messianic movement that, if anyone is curious, you want to see what the real Messianic movement was like during this period, just read Josephus. They were involved in constant conflict against the Roman Empire. There was no compromise, and so Paul is the thing to remember, Miguel, is that the Gospels are not history, but they are anti-history. In other words, it was very important for the Romans to quash the history of the Maccabees, because that family was the emanating point of the Messianic movement. And that's where all the names of the apostles come from. Well, not all, but but Simon, John, Lazarus, Judas, Matthew, these are the names of the Maccabees. So the Romans created an anti-history to blur their history and blur the Messianic movement so that it would be possible for Christianity to float in somehow as a replacement religion. And since the history was so important to the Messianic movement and the genealogy, they just very subtly changed it, little tiny changes, with the idea they knew full well that the Zealots wouldn't buy it, but they were hoping in the further regions, not so close to Israel, that the religion could eventually, takes hold, and they would stop the Messianic movement from spreading. That was one of the, as Josephus wrote, that this was a real threat to the empire, that the Messianic movement was trying to do missionary work to, create a broader rebellion through the empire. And so all the areas where you see Christianity popping up, the Asian minor cities like in Revelation or in Alexandria, these were Roman strongholds, and they simply tried to, subtly slip in this Romanized Messianic movement, and they created, a history for it, overlaying the real history in very subtle ways, just so that everything would be confused. And at the same time, this was they were destroying all the literature of the movement, so that they could eventually change history. It's very significant that, in Greece they have thousands of parchments from this era, from the first century, that have been found. In Judea, they had never found any until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found buried in caves. Okay, so the Romans had scrubbed that religion clean. They just evaporated it. And the literature was so important, it must have been a process of hundreds of years of getting rid of it. Just bear in mind that, the 66-73 rebellion, the famous one where the temple gets leveled, that was just one of a number. In 115, another rebellion broke out, that the same situation. It was such a widespread rebellion that the Jewish Messianic movement, controlled large areas around Alexandria and Egypt and Cyrene. I mean, they were taking over hundreds of square miles. And then apparently they headed up toward Judea. This would have been the very first crusade. Judaism in this era was a geographical religion. They believed that God had given them a specific boundary that marked their Holy Land. The Romans had kicked them out. They rebelled. They headed back to Judea, and the legions met them, and it was an enormous bloodbath. And then that was in 115, and then 133, they were, only 15 years later, they were at it again. This time they took over Judea, and they held it for 3 years. It was such a bloodbath that when they finally got done with the thing, the Roman legions, when they came back to Rome, they wouldn't even give the typical salutation about the legions are well if the Caesar is well, because they were afraid there would be rioting in Rome, because so many Roman families had lost loved ones in the battle against the Messianic movement. So this was the struggle against the Messianic movement was 100 years, all during the advent, supposedly, of Christianity. And it was perhaps the bloodiest conflict in the Roman Empire. So that's the context of Paul. It's his little dietary skirmishes. These are all it's just literature to create a kind of a believable context and to help people move toward the Roman Christianity.
Wow, yeah, definitely a very convincing argument. And what about the the hundreds of apocryphal Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels? Where do they fall into this?
Well, I think that there was Gnosticism. It was quite widespread in the first century and in the second century. Obviously, it's well known. And the reason that the Romans destroyed the movement is quite interesting. It's simply because they couldn't rely on the gods of the religion. The gods of Christianity, the God the Father and Jesus, very carefully controlled by the pontiff, who of course is a Roman bureaucrat. So they have complete control over it, and they control the literature. The Romans had all of these colleges that studied religion that knew its effect, but Gnosticism promoted way too much independent thinking. And in my opinion, the Romans were trying to onset the Dark Ages. In other words, they realized that independent thought was completely, negative to their goal of domination of an empire. They wanted as pacifistic a population as possible. And this was why the Gnostic religions and the heretical Christians were destroyed. I mean, what other reason would the Romans have to spend so much time wiping all of these groups out? It's because they deliberately constructed Christianity to produce a docile and obedient class. And the ultimate purpose of Christianity would be to have an empire that would obey the authority structure and pay taxes without even having to maintain an army. And this, in fact, to some extent occurred. The Vatican was able to continue to get taxes all the way up to Martin Luther, and the army that they had to maintain was essentially smaller and smaller during that time. So really what you had was the patrician class were sort of a kind of religious, they used religion like the mafia would use, strong-arm tactics. They saw how effective it could be. They wiped out religions that they thought were suspicious or could produce independent thought, and they continued to promote Christianity. And, if you look at the level of technology in the Roman Empire, and then just look out 800 years later in Europe, you'll see that they were completely successful. The Christianity had onset the Dark Ages. The people, have, very little technology. It's all been lost, but they're very subservient. So, as far as I'm concerned, the analysis of the Gospels that I suggest makes history quite logical. It's very easy to understand the Gnostic religions and what happened to them and why they were attacked and why Christianity was promoted, because one was a tool of the empire and the other was something that was not.
Kind of finishing off here, I wish we had more time because your book is there's so much evidence, it's not even funny, but how has your book been received? I know you've been on the Jesus Mysteries, banging, hitting the pavement. How has the book been received? I know also it was very hard for you to write it, and
it was difficult
have
to write it.
Give away the secret of Titus, who wants to be known.
Right. Well, it has certainly not been as received as with as much attention as I would like to see. There've only been there's never been a review of the book written in a periodical. The publishing company, Ulysses, is a very small intellectual press, doesn't have a lot of resources to throw in it, so it can only really work through word of mouth. There's never been any advertising for the book. There's never been a review written. Robert Price posted one just on the internet, which is totally negative. So it's been amazing that the book has sold as well as it has. It's been one of the very best sellers of this particular genre.
Oh, wonderful.
But I'm optimistic that we're just really at a threshold right now, because in fall the book will be coming out in German and in Spanish. And the German publisher is Ulstein, which is a much more powerful publishing company. They own newspapers. And I also think that because it's a much more secular nation, that people will be less afraid. I can show you, it would not be appropriate to share, online, but I can show you people who've written back to me from different, newspapers and magazines saying, love the book, fascinated by the book, absolutely will not write a review of the book because it's simply too explosive. They have advertisers who have relationships with Christian organizations. Obviously, Christianity is well established here in the United States, and the more the book is credible, the more people worry about the effects it can have on it. So at the moment, it just circulates by word of mouth, and I have a website, just CaesarsMessiah.com, where people can come and ask questions. And as far as I'm concerned, it's it just has a life of its own at this point. And we'll just have to see how long it takes to to really get up to the point where the questions the book raises are questions of on a national level. And I think that again, I think that the German publication will almost force people in the United States to start doing reviews of the book, and at that point it'll just be a firestorm. I mean, you've read it; you can see for yourself that I believe that it's it's plausible enough that it needs to have these ideas need some sort of response, and I'm confident that it won't be too long, perhaps a year before it'll start being reviewed and discussed. And you can imagine what a difficult process this will be for the nation. There's so many Christians, and the evidence, I think, is clear enough that, particularly once we have a whole cadre of people actually focusing on it and reviewing it, and I think that it won't take too long for people to come to the realization that the Gospels are, in fact, a kind of Roman comedy. And then what happens next is, you tell me. I don't know.
Well, all I know is what was radical yesterday becomes mainstream today. And,
That's right. That's right.
Those
exactly.
who start that always go under a lot of fire, and then they end up redeeming themselves. But,
well, I'm hoping that Gnosticism will actually make a comeback. This has always struck me as the most rational perspective, and
so it's making a little comeback. It
is, yeah, indeed, yeah. And so let's hope that would be a great response. But Christianity is, once the analysis came out of Caesar's Messiah, it's just a question of time. I mean, it might take 10 years, it might take, a month, I don't know. But once the analysis came out, it just can't be put back in a bottle. And there will be a threshold that the information will cross at a certain point, and then you're going to have sort of a firestorm of publicity, and people will be thrashing it about, trying to determine it. And without too much of a period of time, people will realize, hey, we've been had. The Gospels are a joke.
Yeah, I agree. One way or another, I think they're a joke. But anyway,
right,
Joe, I think that's all the time.
Thank you very much for having me, Miguel.
Thank you so much, and good luck with everything.
Thank you. You too.
Have a good day.